to be speaking with Jessica Gross about her work, her recent book. For those of you who don't know me already, my name is, and who are new to Cooper, my name is Erin O'Connor. I'm a professor of education at NYU, where I direct the early childhood program and chief of education here at Cooper. And today we are so lucky to be speaking with Jessica Gross. I know I want her to talk a little bit more about her background, how the book came about, but just as a way of introduction, Jessica writes a very popular opinion writer for the New York Times, where she writes a newsletter on parenting that I'm sure you're all familiar with. She was also the founding editor of Lenny, the email newsletter and website. She writes about parenting, health, culture, politics, and I love this one, grizzly bears. Would love to hear more about that at some point. She was named one of LinkedIn's Next Wave Top Professionals, 35 and under in 2016, and a Glamour Game Changer in 2020 for her coverage of parenting in the pandemic. She was formerly a senior editor at Slate and an editor at Jezebel, and recently she wrote the very popular book, Screaming on the Inside, The Unsustainability of American Motherhood. So thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited for this talk. I was telling Jessica earlier, my undergraduate class read the book, and we were talking about it this morning, and just how amazing conversation among folks who are parents already and not parents as well. So really excited to continue the conversation right now. Jessica, do you want to tell a little bit about like how the whole project came about in terms of your most recent book?
Absolutely. So I've been thinking about these issues for a decade, and it all started when I had a really difficult pregnancy with my older daughter. I had hyperemesis, which is extreme morning sickness. I had to quit a much desired job. It was my first sort of management role because I was so sick. I got incredibly depressed and anxious after, which will happen when you're not holding any food down, and really devoted a big chunk of my career from when I had my older daughter, who is now 10, to exposing the ideals that we have around American motherhood, including pregnancy, and just how hard we make it for anyone, no matter how privileged, to make parenthood work in a way that feels sustainable for them. The book really crystallized for me at the beginning of the pandemic, when I think a lot of people, myself included, had been talking about the ways in which the United States does not serve or support parents for years, but a lot of people who had been feeling that maybe subconsciously or sort of in a subterranean way, it all came crashing down on their heads when the systems of care and structure really just fell apart overnight, and mothers were by and large expected to be the ones picking up all the pieces. And so I think it just became more clear to me and more clear to just so many parents how the United States had no interest in supporting parents. And, something I think about a lot, which I think has fallen out of the discourse just because everyone's moved on from that really tough early period. But I think we should never forget that in most places in the United States, they open bars before they open schools. And that is not how it was in almost any other country in the world, certainly not our sort of peer nations in terms of wealth. And I think it kind of says it all. I talked to about 100 women, mothers over the course of the next 18 months, 2 years to write the book. I talked to all sorts of policy experts. I talked to sociologists, psychologists, education experts. I talked to obstetricians. I talked to economists, because, the issues that are discussed in the book are so deeply intertwined with just so many disciplines. I think motherhood can be siloed and thought of as just like some, unserious women's issue, but it touches everything. Everything in society, really, the way we raise our families. So yeah, that's I hope not too long-winded an answer about how the book came about.
No, I mean, I think that's great. And something that just resonated, with me and my class and I were talking about this morning, was how honest you were about your feelings, about other women's feelings. And that really resonated with me as a mom and someone who works with a lot of moms, is even sort of before the pandemic, a lot of these feelings of loneliness, guilt, anxiety that, come kind of with the role of being a mom. And what I really appreciated what you did in your book was outline sort of how we came to where we are, especially, in American society of viewing motherhood a certain way, and how that view of motherhood, supermom, you kind of go through all the different roles, has really played a role in a lot of our mental health. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about sort of what you found about the historical underpinnings for our current state.
So, I mean, how far back should we want to go? To the beginning of time?
I think we should.
I would say so. It's sort of like all the roots of basically all of our, major Judeo-Christian religion have this idea of a mother should be self-sacrificing. A mother should always put herself last. So that's sort of the seed of it. That's a very old idea. I think the way that it manifested specifically in the United States is we are an extremely individualistic culture, and we always have been. It's that sort of frontier, manifest destiny attitude. And we are also quite a religious society, and specifically a Christian society. And so the ideas around sort of a nuclear family and the nuclear family being the locus of the way to raise children, is overwhelming in a way I think that it is not in a lot of other societies, just in terms of multi-generational living, the idea that it takes a community to raise a child. I mean, those ideas, which seem pretty straightforward and obvious, I think there are a lot of ways in which American mothers are made to feel if they ask for any kind of help outside themselves, and outside their nuclear family, they have failed. They have failed at their job of being a good mother. And so I think the way that is an enormous amount of psychological pressure and weight. If you feel that everything is on you, anything you do, it's all on you to raise the children. So then it would follow that anything you do wrong has outsized impact on your whole family unit and the health and wellness and, future prospects of your own kids. And so, those messages are coming at us just all day, every day, whether we actively resist them or acknowledge them or not.
Something that, we were talking about this morning, it's that idea, you talk about in your book about the time period, which, I think to an extent we still have this going on, but the idea that even if you thought negatively or you thought about somebody else, other than your husband while you were pregnant, that this was going to be, horrible for your unborn child. And just, thinking about how that seems to permeate a lot of even where we are today, I feel like, right?
I was so obsessed with that notion. So it was called maternal impressions. And so what I learned through reporting the book was we did not know scientifically how babies were made until the late 19th century. So way later than I would have thought, this whole sperm and the egg. We didn't know scientifically. And so for a long time, it was thought that only the man's sperm had everything. Women were just the vessels. We weren't doing anything in the process. We were providing no genetic materials. But if we looked at something or thought something, we could affect the way that our babies look. So if you looked at a frog the wrong way while you were gestating a child, your baby could look like a frog. And there was this woman in 18th century England who convinced a bunch of people that she gave birth to a litter of bunnies. And I just love her. She has a Wikipedia page. Her name's Mary Toft. Look her up. But yeah, so that notion kind of is still with us. And I actually talked to a medical historian who I quote in the book, but I can't remember if this part of the interview made it into the book. But she said there are people who still believe that, like that literally today. Because I asked her, I was like, when did people stop believing this? And she was like, people stop believing this. So yeah, that still is underpinning. And I mean, it just also, in some ways, I think that so doesn't give kids enough credit to think of them, babies and kids, as so fragile that any wrong step will destroy, alter them for life. It's like we would not have a human species if if every tiny thing affected babies and children so much, just using common sense. Like, there have always been horrible things happening in society, horrible disease, war, etc. And yet we still go on. And yet we're still getting shamed at Starbucks for ordering a caffeinated drink while we're pregnant. Like, it doesn't make any sense at all.
It is like so beyond the realm of logic, right?
Yes.
But so impactful. And even for those of us who are, sort of have this, framework of kind of knowing what goes on, right? At least I still felt a lot of anxiety when I was pregnant, because these ideas, I feel like, still, even if they're not consciously impacting what we're saying and thinking, I think subconsciously they still are. Even I feel like I didn't do enough yoga. I didn't do, that somehow my baby was going to be anxious when she was born.
I really think that for me, having two kids was very helpful in that, because my kids are their personalities are very different. And so anything I sort of attributed, good or bad, to the way that we raised the first one, it just gets totally washed out by the second one being raised in the same household under nearly identical circumstances, and being, so different, just her personality and the way that she responds to kind of everything. So
I agree. Having more than one does help with that. I'm like, "Ooh, I wonder if we have three, what that would look like." My husband's like, "We're not going to find out." So, another thing that I thought was so interesting in your book was this idea of, sort of this feeling of agency, and feeling like we do or don't have agency over our work choices, our childcare choices, and sort of, I think some of the women that you interviewed, it was sort of, they found a way to find agency at some point. But I'm sort of curious, through all your interviews and your conversations, for women who felt like they did gain agency over some of these decisions, what was sort of, quote unquote, the secret sauce that allowed them to feel that way?
I think one thing was finding a supportive community. So whether that was having a partner who really was a true ally and could, help them navigate, especially early motherhood, which always seems to be the toughest time, or not for everyone, but for many people is the toughest time, because it's such a time where your identity is shifting, and if you're a biological parent, your hormones are all over the place, you're exhausted. There's just so much going on. Having a group of trusted friends that you could bounce, feel supported, just emotionally. And even sort of logistically. So that having family around as well was helpful in that. So just not feeling isolated, I think, was sort of the key. And however that worked out for you. I think another part of it was adapting to whatever your circumstances were, and accepting that things were not necessarily going to be like what your expectations could have looked like. In my own life, before I had kids, I was like, I'm going to be the next Tina Brown. I'm going to run, I'm going to be running the New Yorker or whatever, being really high up in management. And as soon as I had a kid, I was like, oh, I don't want to work that hard at all. And not everyone has a choice with how hard they can work or how many hours they can have. But for me, in terms of my own personal ambition, I was still really ambitious for myself, but the terms of it changed. I still really wanted to write. I still wanted to, work on things that I felt a sense of mission about. But in terms of that sort of like, I'm going to, reach the highest heights of the ladder, that wasn't my desire anymore. And again, everyone is different. I think that's such a big thing too, because I think a lot of the expectations are around like, oh, I have to be a certain way. And depending on your community, that way can be very different. I mean, I talked to women who, military moms, I think especially felt this, because it's a tough life. Your spouse may be deployed a lot. You really, in some ways, have to be signing on to be the primary parent. And I remember a military mom I talked to in the book who came from her dad was in the military. She was married to a guy in the military. she had to come to terms with the fact that like, oh, I actually do want to work. And she felt incredibly guilty about that. And her husband was quite supportive. He was like, I want you to be happy. If you think this is what, is going to make you feel fulfilled, I am like here for it. But in her mind, what a good mother was a mother that stayed home and just only managed the home front. And so she had to sort of come to terms with the fact that like, oh, actually, having some sort of paid job outside the home was like really what she wanted. So I think it's really just figuring out for yourself what is going to work for the new circumstances, but then really having a supportive system with you alongside. Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. And I think you're talking about expectations and something, I think we've talked about this, you talk about it in your book, but thinking also the role of social media, right? In this idea that I think a lot of women, moms turn to it to find a sense of community, but then there's another side to it as well, right? And if you can talk a little bit more about what you learned from speaking with women and various professionals around really the role of social media in maternal mental health these days, and
Yeah.
their expectations.
So, I mean, the internet's a big place. You can find all sorts of things, but there's a certain kind of mommy influencer that I think lives rent free in so many of our minds. And like, she always looks beautiful and her life is perfect and her house is perfect and her kids are always looking happy. And even though intellectually you can know, and I think most of us know at this point, that it's not real and that, social media is a highlight reel. It is not, you don't know that person. You have no context for their actual lives. The joke I make in the book, I think is like, you can see someone your kids go to school with and maybe they're posting the perfect vacation snap and everyone looks happy, but you see them the next day and their kid's having a tantrum at drop off. And so, the reality, but with so many people online, especially those who make their living, it's influencers, you have no context for them other than what they're showing you. And obviously that can create, especially if you're in a vulnerable moment in your life, it can create all of these feelings of inadequacy, failure, just the gamut. And so I think, and on the other hand, I talked to a lot of women for my book, especially who went through sort of specific difficult situations. So the examples that I give are they had a baby in the NICU for a long time. They had a child with special needs. They struggled with infertility for a long time. And unless they knew people in real life who dealt with that exact thing, they could feel quite alone. And so they felt like they really had incredible connection through these online communities and found a lot of practical help, because there are certain things like you wouldn't know if you didn't live through it yourself. So that all said, I think, the psychologist I talked to for the book is all about sort of just making good boundaries around your use of social media, because I think it's not realistic for most people to quit cold turkey. I certainly want to some days, but I need to at least look at it sometimes for work just to, see what, especially on Twitter, I've spent a decade cultivating a list of experts on the beats that I cover. And so there's just no way to replicate that, despite the fact that I find Twitter otherwise to be a garbage fire. It's just, and this is sort of real life advice too, in terms of making friends in this new stage of your life. It's like, she asks her clients often, like, do you even like the people that you're following? Do you even share their values? And if they're making you feel bad and you don't even respect them, like, I think we don't even think about, like, do I like this person when we're following someone and necessarily envying them? And so just taking that step back and thinking, like, do I even care about what they're selling? And you might, like, there are some influencers that people continue to find delightful and helpful and giving you, good advice or tips about what to buy. Like, again, I always try to find the nuance in these things, because I think demonizing any technology or anything is just, it's not where the interesting conversation lies. It's not where the growth happens. But I think, again, having good boundaries around it, being able to say, like, this is not doing anything for me, is really important, and the values piece of it. That's something that really came through in my reporting and my research for me personally, was you can't not feel guilt. Everyone will feel guilt sometimes over their parenting, over, something happening with their families. I think the cliche about you're only as happy as your most unhappy child is completely true. Um, but being able to take a step back from that feeling and be like, okay, I feel guilty. Am I feeling guilty for a reason that is aligned with my values? Or am I feeling guilty for some societal reason that actually doesn't align with my values? And so going through all of this has helped me be able to do that a little bit more. Not all
I
the
really
time.
like the idea of value. Knowing your values and being able to recognize what is supporting your values. And even if you don't feel great about what you're seeing, but it's all like within your value framework,
Yeah.
versus like I felt bad I didn't have a nice dinner for my kids last night because, well, like stuff like that. That's not, I value time with them. I don't value having a perfectly
Right.
prepared meal for them, but whatever. You see all this stuff online and you're like, oh, but most moms are able to come home and have this beautiful meal for their kids, and their kids love it. And I mean, I know that's not true, right? But I still was feeling that last night and thinking, yeah, okay, that's not a value of mine. It is
Right.
spending
And
time
it's
with my children.
also, there's our values and there's our real lives. Like, I really actually like cooking. It's one of the domestic tasks that I look forward to doing. But yesterday I was closing a piece and I just didn't have to, there was just no time. It was not possible. The laws of space and time would not allow for this to happen. And so, there always needs to be a little bit of flexibility, especially when you have young kids. Cause yeah, I'm a very sort of structured, I like structure, but like you need to allow for wiggle room always.
Totally. So we have a question that just came in. Do you think social media brings to light the rest of the public the struggle of parenthood, like postpartum depression, psychoses, and how important it is to check in with other moms?
Oh, absolutely. I think awareness of all of these things has increased wonderfully since I started writing about them. I wrote about prenatal depression when I had it in 2012. And for a very long time, people would email me and say, like, I'd never heard of it until I lived through it. I'm so glad I found your piece. And I get way fewer of those emails now. And I think it's because there's been such a growing awareness and discussion on social media of these real issues. I see the same with just kind of everything around pregnancy and new motherhood, that there's just such an opening to talk about it. The downside, of course, though, is like the internet is open. So if you're going to talk about it, you'll also have people telling you like you're a terrible mother. Like that there's no avoiding that. So I think part of where you're seeing the most sustaining, organic, positive discourse is in private spaces. So either in Facebook groups, on Discord. I think people don't want to put their vulnerabilities out there just to be, belittled, dismissed, hurt. So I think that those sort of more private, still social media adjacent formats are really great for people. And again, always plus minus. I've seen a million dramas on mom Facebook groups. It's like ground zero for wild nonsense. So yes, but I think, there's definitely much more awareness, and I would say it's way more positive than negative.
I would agree. I think something that you use this phrase, the weaponization of research, in your book. And I kind of I see some of that though on social media as well, right? So can you talk a little bit more about this weaponization of research and the role that it's playing in all of these discussions?
Yeah, I actually just saw it yesterday again. The example I give in the book is around sleep training. So sleep train your kids or don't, they're gonna be fine. Either way. I am not for or against. You can have healthy, thriving children no matter what you do. So I just want to say that first, because I do not want to start a fight over sleep. I literally would rather throw myself out this window than have a fight about sleep training, because it should not be a fight. Like, it doesn't, it's what fits. So that's ahead of time. But some folks who are very anti-sleep training use a study about children left in abusive Romanian orphanages in the 80s to claim that sleep training will damage children emotionally. I think it's pretty obvious to say that what went on, the horrible abuses, children left in cribs alone for days on end, is terrible, but it does not have anything to do with like the experience of, in a otherwise safe home, like sleep training a child. And even the people who are citing that research are like, well, it's not exactly the same thing. And it's like, well, then why are you talking about it? And the other thing to note is that most of those kids grew up okay. Like, they didn't have attachment disorders. So in fact, if you look at the study, it's proving like, yeah, just leave your kid alone for 24 hours. They might be fine anyway. No, that's not, I'm just told, that's a complete joke. I don't mean that. That is a joke. So, but it's just to say that always look at the source, the original source that's cited. Because what's sort of crazy too, I've been on this beat for so long that I will see the same citations over and over again. And often they are clearly just citing something that cited the original thing. And as it gets further and further and further from that primary source material, it can just get so twisted in ways where it was like, I'm begging you to go back and read the study. And I feel so terrible for researchers who are so careful to caveat and show their work, and they have their work just completely weaponized and misused to prove things that they themselves would never say or support. And I find this in a lot of the things around parenthood, because the research is unclear. There's very few topics where the only thing in all my years on this beat that I have found where the research is pretty unequivocal is in terms of physical abuse. Don't hit your kids. That's bad. That is always bad. That is very bad outcomes. And the use of vaccines for polio and measles, like, they work, they're good, they save lives. Other than that, there's so much gray area in terms of outcomes for kids. And so, anyone who is just very, and all of this really seems to happen in the pregnancy and early childhood research, because once your kids are going to school, they're just out of your control for so much of the day anyway, right? But I just find a lot of sort of just really, and it's not always, I don't think that it's always bad faith actors, but deliberate or accidental misreadings of research that just wasn't meant to be used that way.
I agree. I mean, I think, childcare too, right? Another one where you often see, that's an area that I've done a fair amount of research in and kind of know what is there. And then you see how it gets further and further, like you're saying, from the original source. And all of a sudden you almost don't even recognize, right, the quote unquote study that they're talking about, because it's been taken so out of context.
Exactly. It's actually a shame, because it's helpful. I mean, I'm glad that there's all of this research on these topics. I think it's important to look at, but once it gets sort of filtered into the mainstream, you just don't know what's going to happen with it.
Well, I think too, when you look at the journal articles, they often have, sort of a discussion, right, where they're talking about, well, it's one of many factors. We have to consider it, the size of this effect versus the size of another effect, but none of that often that nuance is not then taken into the more popular realms. It's more of this like definitive answer, way of reporting it, right, rather than sort of this more nuanced way.
Exactly.
So something, that one of my sort of favorite lines from your book, and something that, I was talking a lot with my students about today, is you're talking about the ambivalence, sort of being comfortable with ambivalence around motherhood, and, I think parenting in general. Can you talk a little bit more about when you say like one of the key takeaways or the key takeaway from the book is this feeling of ambivalence, more about what you meant by that?
Yeah. So, my mom is a psychiatrist, so I have known about the idea of ambivalence for a long time. So it's the I think it's often thought of as being sort of wishy-washy, but really it's having strong feelings in opposed directions. And I think what is so hard for a lot of moms to accept is that just because we have negative feelings about motherhood or our kids, it doesn't mean they don't coexist with our deep love and joy and all of the good things that we feel about our kids. And that, again, it does not make us bad mothers to sometimes just like, I always think of this quote from a diary that I read from the 1860s, where this mom of a newborn says she wishes she could go to a lodge somewhere far in the woods where the cry of babies might never reach me no more. So this idea that mothers have always felt this way, these conflicting feelings at this, and sometimes at the same time. I often describe it as the push-pull, right? It's like you're desperate to get away from your kids, and then you spend the whole night looking at pictures of them and how cute they are. Like, I can't tell you how many people have described that exact feeling to me and the experience. So it's just getting comfortable with that, with the fact that, we're always going to have all of these complicated feelings because we're still humans. Like, becoming mothers doesn't put us in a different category of person that exempts us from the whole range of human emotions. And so that idea to me was kind of underpins everything I've ever written about motherhood. Like, it's just, you are still a human being. You're not some different category of person who needs to be treated differently by society. You're still a person.
And I think, I love that too, because I feel like it got sort of at the guilt feeling, like it's, this idea that we have to always be just over the moon about our children and our new identity and our new responsibilities, and then feeling like not so great about that. I think, that leads to, right, these feelings of guilt and loneliness, because you're like, I feel like I can't talk about the downside or whatever you
Exactly.
want to call it to my new role or my existing role as a mom. And I think just being able to voice that is so important. And I feel like we haven't always had that space.
Absolutely. I don't think we have. And I think it really goes back to what I was saying before about finding people who share your values and are going to listen non-judgmentally to you and share with you their sort of, I just had a text thread with two of my mom friends this morning where we were all just sharing our most petty jealousies about the dumbest stuff. And it allowed me to just let those feelings go for the day, where we all shared, put it away, keep it moving. And if you just bottle those up, it can feel so isolating, because you think you're the only monster that feels this way. But having those people in your life where you can just, I have one of my best friends and I have this like standing thing where we will just call each other and be like, I need to just vomit anxiety to you for 5 minutes. And then you don't even have to, you just need to receive it. And we'll just like, there was one time I called her because I was like, I'm going to yell at my husband about all of this stuff unless I tell it to you. And it's not fair to him. Like, it's not at that level, but I'm so annoyed that I just need to tell it to somebody. And it fixed it. It was just like, I told her the thing. She was like, yes, that's so annoying. I would be so annoyed. And then we could just move on. So I think having those people in your life where you can just have that radical honesty, priceless.
So important. And one of my best friends and I do Marco Polo, which I didn't even know about, by the way, until like a year or two ago. But it's like you send a video and they can either respond right then or not. It's sort of depending on people's availability. But like last night, I was so annoyed that my husband walked home from work, because I was like, I've been home all day with the kids, juggling it all. And like he walked, but it wasn't something like it's a big fight, like it wasn't worth a big fight out of, but I was just like, I have to get this off my chest. So I just sent her Marco Polo and was like, I can't believe he's doing this. It's so annoying. She got back to me and was like, yes, you're right. Done. But if I hadn't had that, it would have become a huge fight.
Right. And it's like, from his perspective, probably he was like, I had a long day of work. I just want some air. Like I need, right. And it's especially, I think, in relationships, which is like another huge thing that changes when you have a kid. I feel like all of our fights are just about who's getting more free time. So I think being able to like empathize and be like, okay, I intellectually understand why you needed to do this, even though it is so annoying and I am so angry about it. So yes, that is a perfect use of the like phone a friend moment.
Totally. Have a lifeline.
Yes, exactly.
Curious, you say, relationships change so much. When you were talking to a lot of the moms, for your book, were there common themes that you found around how the relationship changes, kind of accounting for time, right? But like
Yeah.
other.
I mean, I think you will not be surprised to hear that in heterosexual marriages, many women were very bummed out that they were doing so much more domestic work and childcare. And they even, many of these women were like, my husband is better than most husbands. Like he is trying, not all of them. Some of them were like, my husband sucks and doesn't do anything. But like, or I just had a terribly messy divorce because my husband sucks and he doesn't do anything. So, not everybody, but I think that there is this way in which, especially in modern marriages, until you have kids, it's pretty easy for you to have a very egalitarian, equal situation. And I think it much more than it did in previous generations where that wasn't true. It's just a shock of cold water when you are suddenly hit with this imbalance where once there was balance. And so I think there's some ways in which the early motherhood period, especially if you're breastfeeding, if you're the biological mom, it's tough because they just can't be equal. They can't be there's ways they can help around the edges, but like, there's no way to make that equal. There just is not. So I think, there's just a lot of feelings around that. And it's something that, I found in sort of other reporting that I've done that didn't really end up in that book so much, but has ended up in other newsletters and columns I've done. It's a constant negotiation through your parenting journey, that kind of establishing that balance, continuing that balance, because your jobs are constantly evolving, your kids' needs are constantly evolving. If you have multiple children, that changes the equation. The help you may or may not be getting outside your, family unit, that continues to change. So even though it's tiresome, I find it personally tiresome to continue negotiate those sort of boundaries and problems. It's got to be done. Like the couples that are sort of feel the best about their overall, balance experience, whatever you want to call it, they are reassess periodically how things are doing, and they check in with each other.
Yeah, I think we have a great question I want to get to in the chat, but that, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a clinician the other day, and she was saying, I really find that just being comfortable with the fact that marriage is work and not and recognizing that it's not supposed to be, and it can't be, right, this like perfect sort of, romantic notion of the two of you together all the time and everything's working out. She's like, it takes work to have a successful marriage. And it's okay to say it takes a lot of work. And sometimes it is these like conversations we don't necessarily want to have around boundaries, but that's how, a successful relationship works.
Yeah.
But again, like the ambivalence to an extent, again, seems to be coming out, right? That idea of like, I can love my partner more, very much, but I can also be really annoyed with my partner.
Absolutely. Every day.
And that doesn't. So there's a question in the chat that, do you think the talk of postpartum struggles should be addressed in the hospital by nurses? I feel as nurses, we could do better at educating. In your research, did you find good programs out there that focus on the mom post-delivery? I feel like a lot of the focus on the mom, I totally agree with this, is lost after the baby is delivered.
It's absolutely true. And this is a way the United States fails parents so aggressively. If you live in our peer nations, you have nurses that come to the house free of charge for weeks after you give birth. They come like on the 3rd day, on the 7th day, then they come the next week. They are constantly checking in, making sure your nursing is going okay, checking in with you emotionally. Like there is a structure that supports both the mother and the baby. And the extent to which we are just falling short on that is appalling. I will say that the most successful uh, structure in the United States that I've heard of to deal with this is when there are social workers or psychologists that are within obstetric practices, because it is really hard. The way that the immediate postpartum period is, you're kicked out of the hospital within like 36 hours. So yes, absolutely, like check in with the moms in that immediate postpartum period. But like so much, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is like any sort of depression or anxiety that happens within a year postpartum can be considered postpartum, related depression and anxiety and other mental health issues. And so it's so much, there's only so much you can do in that sort of really brief window that they are there. There needs to be, again, some other touch points for moms to access that care and have people checking in with them. So again, like, I would love to see a visiting nurses program where, it was custom for, professionals to be checking in with new parents. I'm not optimistic that's going to happen anytime soon. But in lieu of that, I think having that sort of connected care within that obstetric checkups, because we're at least supposed to go back and have that checkup every 6 weeks after birth. Not everybody makes it to that check-in, obviously, because of if you unless you have a lot of privilege. If you have older children, who's going to watch them? Like some doctor's offices won't allow you to bring you your older children. What if the doctor's office is a big commute away, and there's just so many barriers to folks getting the care that they need, but it's a start and it's better than nothing.
Did you find that it's becoming more common to have psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers in? Yeah.
No, no, I've only heard about it in a few places. For some reason, Boston and Brigham and Women's always seems to, like Mass General, like that whole sort of system seems, sorry, the guy that's fixing, this is so embarrassing. Like my refrigerator is broken. And of course the guy came to fix it right now.
That's always how it works. So, I also just want to, do your thing.
Yes, sorry about that.
No, please. We're, kind of coming up towards the end, and I want to, make sure we've had people ask questions in the chat, but also folks want to just sort of jump in with questions as well, in the remaining minutes that we have.
Yes, Mariel's noting the pediatrician too, having, people embedded in the pediatric practices. It's so important because there needs to be touch points for that are checking in, because part of it is like you might not even know that what you're experiencing is outside the realm of sort of a normal postpartum response, unless someone's actively asking you and checking in, and that is a regular and normalized thing to do. So absolutely having it in embedded services in pediatric practices is another way to address it. But I think that might be even rarer than having it embedded in obstetric practices, though. I don't even know if that's something people collect data about.
I don't know. It's like Healthy Steps and other programs that are targeted towards that embedded,
Yeah.
like co-located services. I see
Yeah.
that taking off more again in still overserved communities largely, or at least in states that have the budget to support that. But I think
Right.
that's one direction, because sometimes, and I think this is to all of your work, the saddest point on that is that sometimes we only get mothers to accept care when we talk to them about their care in the context of their baby and how important it is for their baby, if we can't convince them it's important for themselves, which is like so depressing that that is a thing. But I have found in my practice, it's one of the essential ways to convince a woman that this is not a luxury. And
Absolutely.
it's so striking that we still are there, but I think sometimes
Absolutely. It's ridiculous. And I think that there's a not also unreasonable fear if you are from a minority community
Yes,
that you will be criminalized for
absolutely.
admitting that you have a mental health issue in the postpartum period, or if you are in a marriage. I mean, I've seen it weaponized in divorce cases. Like, it's not just, it's hard enough if you have an otherwise supportive community surrounding you to get help for these issues, but there are not unreasonable fears about accessing this care that, again, just absolutely break my heart, but is for sure the reality of the situation.
And as a social worker doing those assessments, there's also the fear, if I raise these issues, I won't have somewhere to send them. I won't have a service to give them, and I
Right.
will raise it all and not be able to help with it. And that again just speaks to our systems. And like, I know so many providers on the healthcare side of things were like, oh, we can't ask about that, because if we start screening for that and we start asking for that, we're going to have to do something about it. And that structure doesn't exist. So it's just
Yep.
this horrendous cycle.
And there's already such a shortage of mental health care. It's, I hope as we sort of emerge from this period that we'll come up with some more structural systemic solutions, because I mean, it's just like everything. Every day I'm reading about the shortage of
Yeah.
maternity wards. Like, even that, like, especially if you live in a rural area, like, you don't even have a maternity ward. Like, it's so terrible.
It's so terrible. And, I think it is true. Like, we worked with pediatricians for a while, and we wanted them to give it's just a survey around postpartum depression. And they stopped because of what you were saying, Marielle, is that they said, I don't know, I get this information and I'm concerned about this mom, but I don't know where to send her. So, unfortunately, the solution was not to do it, which is very sad, not to try to find supports out there. But I do think it is such a huge concern that until we have all these different structures in place, how can we really support moms during this period?
No idea. I mean, the best we can.
Well, you're getting word out there at least.
I mean, it's the least I could do.
Sort of this is sort of a side question, but since you do, write about parenting for the New York Times, and, you have this book out now, have you found that what you learned through researching for the book has sort of, changed at all what you're focusing on in terms of your, day-to-day writing for the New York Times?
Not really. I actually have, we took the sort of on parenting off my newsletter, because I do want to write about things that are not just, family policy, family related. I will absolutely continue to write about them, but I sort of felt like I was repeating myself. Like, how many times can I write about how the childcare system is fucked and no one cares? Like, I can tell you that I've written about it, I want to say 8 times in the past 3 years. And I'm still going to write about it when it is, when there are changes or news or whatever. But I'm just like, I need the ability to write about other things. And so actually today's piece was about the market, sort of rapacious telemarketing companies marketing mental health care in a very disturbing way on social media, and how there's basically no regulation of how direct to consumer pharmaceuticals are marketed towards Americans. In the United States and New Zealand are the only 2 countries that allow direct to consumer pharmaceutical advertising in the first place. And because corporations are people, they basically think that there's no way to stop direct to consumer pharmaceutical marketing. And because of a relaxing of telemedicine laws at the beginning of the pandemic, a couple of, a lot of telemedicine companies are advertising potentially addictive drugs directly to consumers. And some of them have already been regulated. Some of them have already been sort of shut down and not allowed to continue prescribing because they don't have the appropriate guardrails for addictive medication. And others seem to be just continuing. But I focused on the ad side of it because I don't have struggles with addiction in my past. But if I did, I'm pretty sure that seeing an ad for ketamine every time I opened Instagram would not be helpful for me.
No. That's, oh, wow.
Yes.
That's another conversation. I would love to talk. I during the pandemic. Yeah.
Go to the nytimes.com today. It's right up there. Yes. And I talk about the ADHD meds too. So those are the two. Every time I open my Instagram, I'm trying to be convinced that I have ADHD because I'm a perfectionist. And again, I don't want to, this is not to minimalize people who do have ADHD and need care, but the way that the advertisements work and follow you around can feel incredibly invasive. And it's not just like, yeah, it's bad enough when it's a pair of shoes, but it's another thing if it's a potentially addictive drug. So yeah, how's it affected my work at the Times? I'm broadening it to adjacent topics.
So important. And I know we're running short on time, so I want to get to what would probably be our last question, but this is something that I was thinking about as well. Have you found that postpartum can also happen long after, like older kids are hard to manage too?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's sort of like, even in the discussions of childcare, one of the big issues that I think is totally discussed, I mean, I've written about it once. Aftercare programs for school age kids have been totally decimated by the childcare shortage. I'm so lucky that my kid's public school has a great program that doesn't seem to have been hurt. It's still their spots, it's whatever. But like I've heard about from people across the country who were like, pre-pandemic, this was how we made our life work. And now there's, 50 fewer spots. And now it's a lottery and my kids didn't get into the program. And I don't know what am I going to do? I can't stop working at 2:45 every day. Like, so there's so many, I mean, it never stops in terms of sort of having to manage. And I think, in terms of, mental health issues and as your kids get older, I think, there's a sort of relentlessness of it that I think, especially the pandemic maybe exacerbated because there's no break. There's no break. And it's, I think there's sometimes if people have that awareness of like, oh, this is just going to be relentless forever, that can be difficult to grasp. And so I think, again, I hate giving this advice because it just feels so unhelpful, but it's just like any way you can make time for yourself in any way and do the things that bring you life and make you realize that you are a person outside your family. It is so hard to make that time. I know we all work very hard. We have obligations. We have sandwich generation obligations. That's another thing I've covered is just like so many folks are caregiving, not only for young children, but also older family members at the same time. But whatever you can do to stay sane is necessary.
Definitely. I know we're running out of time, but something, with older children, I felt a little bit like, because I'm now the mother of a teen as well as a toddler, that even with the research, I kind of felt like, oh, I was sold a bill of goods to an extent. Like it was like, oh, you can really go back to focusing on career when your child gets older. And now it's like, I feel like I need to be present and on almost not more, but, because you have those small opportunities to be with your older child, right? But also they're grappling with a lot of heavy stuff. So it's like trying to figure out, okay, I'm trying to kind of get back to my own life, but my child also needs me at this very important point in time, which I feel like sometimes we don't always talk about. So when we get to that point in our children's lives, it comes as almost like a shock.
I guess I always find that sort of like when my kids are like super need me, that's like actually quite clarifying. I mean, again, everyone feels so differently, but it's always like, yeah, you go first. Like, it's just never like if the kids are like, whatever is a real crisis, it's just like, yeah, it's no contest. Like those moments I find almost like totally clarifying because it's like, yeah, who cares about work right now? Like, this is an actual problem with my children that are the world to me. Like, yeah, it's just what it is.
It totally is. Well, Jessica, we're running out of time, but thank you so much. This was
Oh,
such a wonderful conversation.
my pleasure. Thank you so much.
And I'm sure
That's
everyone knows where to find you, but do you just want to mention sort of the New York Times and
Sure. In the New York Times, I write Wednesdays and Saturdays. JessicaGross.com is my website, JessicaGrose.com. My last name is spelled wrong, or the German way, however you want to say it. And you can find my book wherever books are sold, Screaming on the Inside.
And if you haven't read it, I could not put it down. I emailed Jessica one night. I was like, I never stay up past 9. I stayed up till like 2 a.m. to finish it. I was like, I can't put it
Oh
down.
my God. As a writer, that's like the greatest thing you could ever tell me. Like, just that. Thank you so much.
Amazing.
It was very nice to meet all of you. Take care.
Bye, everyone.